In this presentation, I want to discuss Agamben's ideas around bare life and killable bodies. According to Agamben, we have misunderstood life, body, and politics. Now, the best way to get a grip on his ideas is to consider his point about the Holocaust. For him, the Holocaust, the massacre of Jews and Gypsies and others, the number of millions during the Nazi regime in Germany, was not an anomaly or an aberration. And what he departs from is the question of how is it possible for the state to both protect life and to authorize a Holocaust? His answer is Zoe and Bios, or put another way, you have two kinds of life in our culture. Now, you might not realize this, but the classical Greeks did. For the classical Greeks, there was Zoe, which is your biological, your bare or your personal life. And you had Bios, which was the sweet or the good or the public life. So you have biological life and public life. Zoe and Bios. Now, the way to understand this is the figure of the Homo sacer. Now, if I guess it's the Romans in this picture. If the Romans are in battle and they are about to be beaten, somebody will be selected to run into the enemy and sort of go berserk, if you like, and try and kill as many of the enemy as he could. Is that he is killable after he's run berserk in the enemy. If he doesn't die then, he is killable. He cannot be sacrificed because he already belongs to the gods. He's already said, okay, I don't belong in the living anymore. I'm going to the realm of the dead. So he already belongs to the gods, and he is sacred, but he cannot be sacrificed because he already belongs to the gods. Also, killing him doesn't amount to murder. It's less than homicide. It's something else. He's already given up his bios, his good life, and all that's left now is his bare life or his Zoe. So he's given up his public life, and all that remains is a bare biological life, a kind of breathing organism, but not somebody who's entitled to rights like being protected from being murdered and so on. All right, another way to understand this is the conundrum. When people in the West say the king is dead, long live the king. How can this make sense? Agamben thinks this points to the idea of two lives again, in the king's two bodies. So he gets this from a classic work in political theology, medieval political theology by Kantorowicz. Now, Kantorowicz says that the king has two bodies. When you said the king is dead, long live the king, the long live the king bit refers to the body politic or the spiritual aspect of the king that cannot be touched, never ages, is not young or old. You can make effigies and make a colossus of this spiritual king. And on the death of the spiritual king, this passes on to his successor. And that is its public life, its bios. Now we can contrast that with the king's physical body, which can be seen or touched. Now, if you kill the king, it's not homicide. It's actually more than homicide. It's a special kind of killing that's called regicide, and it has its own particular rules and laws and attached to it. So, for example, if I had killed the king in medieval England, there would be a special kind of procedure, a special kind of court, and a special kind of trial, and a special kind of punishment specifically for killing that body. And that refers to his Zoe, his bare or biological life. Now, anthropologists are familiar with this distinction from the work of Fraser, talking about the king of the wood in Nemi. There's a king who prowls around the wood, and if a slave comes along and breaks the branch off a certain tree, can go and kill the king and become king himself. So each slave's body, if you like, is like that Zoe. The bios is this kingship that passes on from one person to another person, that never dies, that never ages or anything. So there's two bodies in the king. When you say the king is dead, you're referring to the body natural, and when you're saying long live the king, you're referring to the body spiritual. All right. So in terms of history and in terms of contemporary relevance, we can see this in relation to the treatment of indigenous peoples under colonialism. There was this idea that you could get, for example, indigenous people, in this case, the Red Indian, as he was known, who was a kind of killable body. It was all right to kill him, right? The only good Indians, a dead Indian was the famous expression. And you can transform, you can kill that, or the other option is to transform it into public life, into bios. And that was the kind of logic associated with settler colonialism. Another example would be this, another case, you get this Indian boy and transform him, who only has Zoe, so he can be killed and it's not considered murder. And you can transform him into bios, which is a good life, a life that has bios, that has a public aspect. Another example of this would be this Pacific example of these, I don't know, a village in Puka Puka under heathenism and the same village under Christianity. So the idea here is that being colonized can transform the natives as they are rendered from being Zoe, a kind of bare biological life, into a good public life of bios. So the point that Agamben focuses on, especially in relation to the Holocaust, is the ability of states in the modern era to deprive human beings of their bios, of their public life, and reduce them to Zoe, reduce them to being killable bodies. So you might wonder what all the stuff we've been talking about before was, but if you compare that with the Homo sacer is also legally killable. And the king is not legally killable in the sense of murder, but his body is killable in the sense of regicide. It's another kind of crime. So it doesn't count as normal human bios life when you kill the body of the king. And with Jewish citizens, that's the point, is they're not citizens. So with German citizens prior to World War II, the point is to strip them of their citizenship and their right to participate in the good public life, which renders them merely as Zoe, as biological life, which is legally killable. But Agamben says it's not just the Holocaust, and for Agamben this is important. It's not just the Holocaust. One of the big cases that post-war medical technology first thrust upon the American public was the case of Karen Quinlan, who went into a severe coma after taking, I can't remember what it was, some very strong drugs on a diet or something like this. In any case, it doesn't really matter exactly how she got there, but she was in a sort of vegetative state. I mean, it was pretty terrible. The only thing she would have was fits. She showed almost no brain activity and really was very little different from a vegetable. So her parents actually wanted to be able to pull her off life support, but they were not allowed to legally initially, but eventually a legal decision came in their favour and she was allowed to be taken off life support. In fact, I can't remember exactly what they took her off, whether it was the feeding machine or the breathing machine or whatever. When they took her off one of the machines in particular, she survived, so she wasn't actually killed in the end by her parents. But if she had died as a result of her parents' actions, it wouldn't have been considered murder. Now, for Agamben, that's troubling. For a lot of us, it's not very troubling, but for Agamben, it is very troubling because he says what's happening here is we're allowing the US state to deprive a person of her of her bios, of her good life, and reduce her only to biological life, in the same way that the Nazi regime stripped Jewish people of their bios, of their public lives, and made them merely biological or bare life or Zoe. Now, maybe Agamben wouldn't say that the situation is exactly the same. I think you would find the case of the Nazis more morally reprehensible, but he's concerned about that power that we vest in the state. And we can see that in relation to, the opposite of the Jewish thing was that everybody else in Hitler's Germany become the folk, Hitler's folk, the people who have this bios, have this sweet life, this good life, this public life, which is only centered around Nazism. So the main point here is that there's biological life and bios, and they're not the same. This is what's very confusing for a lot of students, unfortunately, because the letters BIO occur in both. But bios is public life. That's the good life that we strive for. Biological life is Zoe. It's the bare life. Okay, so hopefully the two uses of bio don't confuse you too much. And in fact, for the rest of this lecture, I won't use either the term biological life or bios to make it a bit easier. All right, the next thing we move to biopower. What is biopower? Is it a kind of laundry detergent that cleans your clothes? Is it a car that runs only on, I don't know, what is that? Reptiles? Sugarcane? Leaves? I don't know. It's neither of these. The exciting answer to the question is, it comes from Foucault's idea of the inclusion of bodies into the mechanisms of state power. When we're talking about bodies here, we're talking about human bodies, which is crucial in the study of the anthropology of body and mind. Now, from another presentation I've done on governmentality, you know that governmentality is a kind of a way of knowing. So for example, people are classified. In current Australia, you have Indigenous, non-Indigenous, you have people whose languages are other than English at home, in other words, ethnic minorities. You have also what we call lower socioeconomic groups, at-risk groups, all these kinds of things. These are classifications. So same patterns occur according to Foucault and Agamben in Hitler's Germany. You have Jew, you have communist and gypsy who are bad, and you have German folk who are presumably on their way to being pure Aryans who are good. And then people are compartmentalized. So you resettle, for example, nomadic Aboriginal people into camps, or you relocate gypsies into settled villages, or you put concentration camps. Now, for Foucault, this creates docile and productive bodies, the kind of modern subject that I talked about in the presentation on Foucault and governmentality. Let's look at this in more detail. In particular, Foucault seems to preempt Agamben's claim in his own Foucault's work, The History of Sexuality. When he said, if genocide is indeed the dream of modern power, this is not because of the recent return to the ancient right to kill. It is because power is situated and exercised at the level of life, the species, the race, and the large-scale phenomena of the population. So before, the monarch in medieval Europe would kill a criminal according to the monarch's ancient right and might tear his flesh to pieces and so on, especially He had done something really bad, like try and kill the king. These days, that's not how power is exerted. You think about police when they arrest a criminal, a suspected criminal, they always carefully put him in the police car so that he doesn't doink his head on the roof of the car. So the power is not really exerted against bodies in a physical way, but it's actually preserved against species. It sort of works in terms of species and the population. So you develop certain classes of people, such as, for example, Jews as a sort of race who you can do this to, or Aboriginals as a race who you can do that to. Or if you took it more generally, you have the large-scale phenomena of the population, the kind of governmentality I talked about in the Foucault lecture on governmentality. So the point here is that there's a new kind of power that emerges in the modern period, and it's related not to the ancient rights to kill individual people, but larger categories or classes of people. So Agamben advances this idea of Foucault of biopower, and he advances it as a way to answer the Holocaust question. Governmentality or biopower concerns itself with the political subject, and this political subject is constituted as they're belonging to a class or a race, the lower class, the gypsies or whatever. And bodies are included into the mechanisms of state power. There are certain kinds of subjects, such as like the German folk, the Aryan person, who is allowed to take part in the Reich, in the nation, and then there are other kinds of bodies who are excluded. So this is the political subject, who, not which, who is categorized, mapped, and recorded, etc. So the people who live east of this line are Polish people, and they are fit to work in the labor camps. And this political subject is the principal object of state power, according to Agamben. This political subject, a person who belongs to, or an individual belonging to a class or a caste or a race. So from a state's perspective, you have Zoe, like you have an Aboriginal person and a Jewish person. An Aboriginal person in the 1800s in Australia must be linked to bios through development. So you take them away from their family, you put them with another family and raise them as a good white Christian child, and that way the Aboriginal child will get bios. The other option is you just annihilate the Aboriginal person, you just kill him or her. So the concept of body is already caught in the deployment of power. So there's no kind of pure body, if you like. This the way that the body is configured in the West already makes it subjected to power. And you have this the biopolitical body in the West is the latest or the latest incarnation of the Homo sacer. So the biopolitical body, as it's constructed in the West, is a body that can now be legally killed. Now, I know this is sounding a bit vague and slightly contradictory. My understanding of Agamben is that the theorist himself is slightly vague and contradictory. So for me, this is getting a little bit inconsistent here, but that's the best understanding I can give on Agamben. So, according to Agamben, the most important thing here is the right to exclude from political life. For him, the original political relationship is not one of class or ruler and ruled or subject and monarch or citizen and state. The original political relationship is the exclusion or the ban. So if you think about, for example, when the army declares a curfew, what the army is doing is putting a ban on any activity after a certain hour, say 9 o'clock at night. And if you go outside during that curfew, you can be killed because your body is no longer political life, but all you have is bare life, which can be killed. So it's sovereign power, in this case the army, which is sovereign, produces bare life. Now, the next point is quite tricky and nifty. It used to be in the medieval period, and actually to a large extent in the ancient Greek period, that the city was the biopolitical paradigm. You know, in the Greek city you have, for example, citizen and slave. In the medieval city you had, for example, free men, you had the guilds, you had the monarchs, the aristocrats, etc. He says now that was the biopolitical paradigm of life in the past. These days it's the concentration camp that is the paradigm, that is the predominant model, a place where bare life is kept. So if you think about the famous example of the Boer War, one of the early examples of the use of concentration camps, the Boers were rounded up by the English during the war and put in camps. There they died and succumbed to all kinds of diseases, which are horrific numbers of casualties. It is that stripping away of public or good life such that all that remains is bare life or a killable body. For Agamben, is that stripping away that is the predominant model for contemporary politics. So politics isn't about the West versus Islam, left versus right, democracy versus totalitarianism. We have made the mistake of questioning who should be sovereign. Should it be God, for example, for a fundamentalist Christian, the majority for a Democrat, the proletariat for a communist, the Führer for the, sorry, bad spelling, the Führer for the German Nazi? That's not the point. What we should be worried about is whether the power of exception should exist or not. So the relevance here is that, again, this is an anthropological theory that to help us understand the body. And what Agamben does in a complicated and sometimes vague and at the times contradictory way, what Agamben does is describe two kinds of life and correspondingly two kinds of body. Now that theory gives us new insights into the treatment, for example, of refugees in different parts of the world, as I lecture in 2016, where we are experiencing what is widely termed at the moment a crisis. And we have refugees being put into camps and arguably, if we look at it through the lens that Agamben provides us, being stripped of public or good life and being reduced to bare life or biological life, where it really doesn't matter if they live or die. All right, thank you for listening, and I look forward to speaking on some other issues about body and anthropology.